At this point in the course, we're focusing on leading congregational communities and the role that communication plays in the leadership process. I'm going to have three mini lectures, sort of three parts to this, starting off this conversation about understanding both leadership communication and then the importance of finding our leadership message as leaders. Communication is one of these dimensions of leadership that are very critical. When we think about the complexities of our organizations, leaders need to pay attention to a number of factors, including leadership of themselves, leading of other individuals in the dyadic form, leading in team contexts and group contexts, leading at broader divisions and organizations, and then translating all of that into having an impact on the world around us and society. Well, good leaders understand that communication is key for all these roles, whether it's the intrapersonal side of communication, making sure that we are giving good self-leadership to our own lives and processing things in a manner that's consistent with what we are desiring to accomplish in the world around us. But then engaging in communication. Now, I've said this at other points, and I'll say it here, that I find that communication is a central skill that leaders need to press into when it comes to leadership. Now, we might argue even that you could have somebody who's an effective communicator who's not necessarily an effective leader. But anytime you find an effective leader, they are by definition going to be someone who knows how to communicate well. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be these tremendous off-the-charts public speakers to large groups. There are other forms of communication that are also essential. Engaging in that dyadic form, the team form, divisions and organizations and departments. So paying attention to communication at all of these levels is key in looking at leadership from a multi-level perspective. I want to talk a bit about the complexities of communication. Lest we think that communication is simply talking, we need to pause and recognize that it actually is a very complex system and process that includes both a message that has both explicit and implicit messages to it. We have the sender and receiver in a communication process reminding us that it's not just about speaking, but about listening. It's not just about sending a message, but receiving a message. And also paying attention to the intrapersonal elements of communication that are happening within us, as well as the environmental and contextual dimensions that are around us. We want to highlight some of these in this slide. So first of all, when we look at the message itself, the most obvious form of a message usually comes in its verbal or written expression. That's where we see the message coming about with the most clarity. But of course, messages do not always come simply in verbal or written forms. They come in nonverbal forms as well. And sometimes the nonverbal cues are even more important than the verbal cues. For instance, when you're talking to somebody and you ask them how they're doing, and then with a frown on their face and crossed arms and a furrowed eyebrow, they answer back to you and say, "I'm fine." We recognize that there might be a disconnect between the verbal message that they've communicated of "I'm fine" with the nonverbal message that says there's something that probably is not fine about their life at the moment. Another story, another message that's being communicated. And now sometimes those messages come in conscious or unconscious ways. In other words, a person might be aware of that, or they might be unconscious of their doing those types of things in communication processes, but they still become part of the message, whether we intend them or do not intend them to come, whether they're intentional or unintentional, or whether they're conscious or unconscious. We also recognize that there are more cognitive-oriented head dimensions in communication. There's more affective-oriented heart dimensions of communication. Both are important. Speaking to the heart. In fact, one of our little character images on this screen has this picture of the heart reminding us that at the core of communication lies the heart of individuals as both receivers and senders in the communicative process. There's also action and inaction. It may not be something that is spoken. It may not even be a nonverbal cue that is acted out. It may actually be inaction that communicates. Now, when you think about things like laissez-faire leadership, these hands-off approaches to leadership, it's an example where a leader disengaging and being unparticipative in this sort of laissez-faire hands-off approach communicates a lot to a community about their action and their engagement in that process. There is a message even without communicating it verbally, and even when it is an inaction that's communicating. Well, in the context of this sender-receiver communication dialogue, we'll notice these arrows are not just sort of one way. There is a two-way process of communication. There are feedback loops. There's a circular dimension to communication. But embedded within each of the individuals, whether we're talking about a dyadic structure or whether there are multiple individuals involved, all of the parties involved have their own intrapersonal conversation that informs their interpersonal conversation. So it's the ideas and the feelings and the histories that people bring to the table. Now here we have this frame of purpose, personal history, psychological noise, interpersonal dialogue, and emotions. Each individual coming to the communicative process likely is bringing their own intention. What are they wanting to accomplish? What are they wanting to communicate? What are they wanting to understand? And that influences the interaction that's happening in that interpersonal communication. We also bring our histories, and our histories influence us. We might receive things differently based upon our histories and how we have engaged in the historical frames that we bring to communication engagement. There's also what is sometimes referred to as psychological noise. We'll talk about noise external to the individual as well in a moment. But there is a first-order dimension of recognizing that there can be intrapersonal dialogue that is creating psychological noise. Rather than focusing on the conversation with the person in front of me, I might be thinking about what am I going to have for lunch, or what am I going to do when I get home tonight with my family. All of those things might be legitimate things to think about, but they create a distraction. There's an interpersonal dialogue that creates psychological noise for my presence in the immediate communication process. Emotions can do this as well. Maybe the conversation is something that is making me feel anxious or making me think about issues that I've not pondered before, and that can raise emotions to the surface in one's heart. And this, of course, not only happens with the sender, but also the receiver. We, of course, flip roles when we begin to listen rather than speak. And again, we need to pay attention to these dimensions, what's happening at that intrapersonal level. In addition to this noise that is psychological noise, there also is environmental noise. The classic example might be if you're preaching in a church context and there's a baby crying out in the sanctuary, or loud music coming from the youth room, or a lawnmower that's passing by a window when a class is going on. All of these things create environmental noise, which are not necessarily bad elements, but they can be distracting elements to the communicative process. In my household, we have a full household, 5 kids, so if I am wanting to have a real heart-to-heart conversation with a friend, sitting in the middle of my living room might be the appropriate place. If it's something that's a real painful experience for a person, it might not be the best place because there's kids running through and noise there. I might need to think about another context in order to engage in that sort of pastoral care moment with an individual. So environmental noise, interpersonal noise, the exchange of the message itself, and all these elements that contribute to the message. Communication is a complex process, and we need to pay attention to these complexities in order that we can lead well through communication and make sure that we are communicating and connecting with the people that we care about in this process. I want to talk for a moment now about the concept of other-centered leadership communication. It's really easy in a communication process to keep things focused on our own perspective, our own issues, to be focused on our needs in a communication process or our content in a communication process rather than really paying attention to the needs of the receiver. Now, I'd argue that servant leadership philosophy is one of the best approaches to applying to communication theory, in that servant leadership argues that first and foremost, the leader should be focused on the needs of the led over the self-interest of the leader. Now, practically speaking, if that is somebody who is focusing on the needs of the led, that applies to communication exchanges as well. Are we really attentive to the needs of this follower, the needs of this team member, the needs of this coworker in this communication process? In a book by Mark McCloskey, Tell It Often, Tell It Well, it's a book focused on evangelism, and he spends a little time in this book on evangelism talking about communication styles in light of the importance of people hearing the gospel and being impacted by the gospel. Now, in this roadway to other-centered communication, there's sort of a 3-stage process moving from a self-centered communication style to a message-centered communication style onto an other-centered communication style. Now, in the other-centered communication style, this is often what happens when somebody is a little less experienced in an area. They're talking about something they're less familiar with. They are new to a teaching role or a preaching role. They're new to evangelism. Whatever the case might be, oftentimes when we bring limited experience to the table, that adds a fear that is inherent in our lives. Fear of what other people are going to think of us, how we'll be perceived in those situations, feeling of unease. And generally, these experiences are increased because we have an unfamiliarity with the message. So that lack of understanding around the message gives us a more insecurity in how we are being perceived in that process. And so it leads to a very self-oriented, self-centered communication style. The focus is on how am I being perceived rather than is the receiver actually hearing and understand and receiving the message. Well, in this moderated way, moving on from self-centered communication style, there's sort of a second stage that often happens with individuals as they grow in their familiarity with the topic and in their communication capacity, and that is a message-centered communication style. In this message-centered approach, really it is about not wanting to get things wrong, wanting to make sure that the content is accurate, and paying less attention to who they are as the communicator and who the receiver is as the receiver, and focusing on the message. Message-centered communication style. In this, there's a tendency towards monologue that happens, and there tends to be more focus on the message rather than the receiver or the listener in that communication process. Now, that's fine, except for what matters most is whether or not receivers and listeners have actually learned and understood what's being communicated. So there's a challenge. I remember one time when I was just starting to participate in the life of the church as a high schooler, and I'd volunteered to help out with a Sunday school class. And this was a group of elementary school boys that I was helping out with. I was the second teacher. There was an adult male that was also teaching in that context. And I remember thinking to myself how boring the class felt as this person just sort of walked through, talked about, lectured about content to these elementary school boys without really attending to how do they need to receive this? How do they need to hear it in a way that they can connect with the powerful message of the gospel in the Bible? Well, I think that individual had a great heart, but was being very message-centered in their style of Sunday school teaching. Likewise, when we're newer to an approach, newer to an area, that tends to be where we focus. We focus on the message rather than the people who are in the room with us. I know early on in my teaching, this was sort of my temptation when it comes to communication, to be so worried that I'd get things wrong or not have an answer for students, or that there'd be a question that would be asked that I wouldn't know how to respond to, or that I wouldn't be prepared. All of those things were kind of elements of the self-centered communication style, and that ended up expressing itself in a very message-centered oriented approach. Well, as I've kind of moved on and into my second decade of teaching in higher ed, it's a little easier now to focus on the students in the room, to pay attention to, are they getting it, to dialogue about the issues and the topics that we're engaging. And that is that final step that we want to aspire to, whether we're talking about a classroom or a team meeting in the church, working with people that report to us in a ministry context, whatever the environment is. Can we get past thinking about just ourselves, get past thinking about just the message, and focus on the person that needs to actually hear and receive that message? Now, connecting this to some larger leadership themes, if you look at the Nordhaus book, you've probably had a chance to engage Nordhaus's book, Leadership Theory and Practice, in your program. Well, there are two different chapters in there, one focused on situational leadership and another focused on contingency theory. Let me just pause for a moment to talk about that difference as a way of illustrating how we can move towards other-centered communication as leaders. So in contingency theory, the emphasis is on leaders are really designed one way. They are who they are, and the goal of contingency theory is to place that leader in a location where they are best going to be able to thrive, whether it's a focus on relationships or a focus on results, a focus on people or a focus on performance. Where are they in that kind of continuum? Find out where they are and place them in the right location. Situational leadership would say that it really is the responsibility of the leader to respond to the needs of their followers. So based upon their level of competency and commitment. We won't walk through all of this, but this is an overview of situational leadership too. Based on the follower's competence and commitment, the leader responds and adapts with the appropriate level of direction and support. It's very different than contingency theory. Contingency says place the person in the role where they'll thrive because that's who they are, and they're really not supposed to change much. The situational leader is supposed to learn how to adapt to the environment. Well, I would argue that the best kinds of leaders do a little bit of both. Find a position that works for you, and then once you're there, begin to adapt and work with and be flexible in how you are applying your leadership with these individuals. Well, if we apply it to communication theory, there really is then a focus on turning our attention to how to be engaged with and focused on the other in the communication process. So I encourage you to ponder some questions here. What can get in the way of other-centered communication for you? Or what are some critical issues that you as a leader must be aware of and address in order to engage in other-centered communication? Perhaps it's paying attention to some of those experience issues of getting more familiar, gaining more experience, so you can turn your attention away from thinking about how you're being perceived to focusing on the message and the receiver. Maybe you are at a point where you have moved past that, you have experience, but you still feel like you're very focused on the message and content. Well, raise your heads up from the notes. Start paying attention to the people in the room a bit more, and kind of coach yourself through how can I be more responsive to and focused on the needs of others as we're engaged in this communication exchange. Well, this leads us to the end of our part 1 time. We will conclude here and we'll pick up with part 2 in a moment.